Good evening. My name is Karen Freeman Wilson, and I would like to thank you all for joining us today. I have the honor of being the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League, and we're excited to join with our partners at Casa Central in co-hosting this parents forum. As parents, one of the most serious responsibilities that we have is serving as consumers of education for our children. Of late, there has been a lot of discussion, not just about education, which we know is so important, but about the governance models at the public schools. Today, we're going to have that discussion and give you information that will allow you to determine for yourself you would prefer. Of course, we know that the final, but as educated consumers and ultimately informed voters, determination of how you would like your representative to vote. Finally, let me thank all of our speakers for spending your evening with us, and thanks to attend. At this time, I'm excited to welcome someone who is not only a partner in this forum, but a friend, a co-chair. We co-chair together, Two-Thirds United, and I am so excited to welcome to the virtual stage, Marty Castro. Marty, take it away.
I'm sorry, Karen. This is Connie. Marty got kicked out of Zoom. And Kelmeta or Q, it doesn't look like it's live on Facebook.
It is on my end. I'm seeing it there.
Okay, in that instance, then we will wait. Oh, it looks like he's back. There he is. So we're going to have Marty Castro greet you on behalf of Casa Central. Marty, you're on mute. You're still on mute, Marty.
How's that? I know I've been translated because I saw my translation, so I'll start again. Thank you. It's been a little bit challenging from a technology perspective. You wouldn't think that I've been doing Zoom calls for the last 16 months, but in any event, I want to thank the Chicago Urban League for inviting Casa Central to be part of this really important forum today. Casa Central and the Chicago Urban League are representatives of the majority of Chicagoans and the majority of the parents and students that make up the Chicago Public Schools. So we felt it was important, while neither of our two organizations have formally taken a stand on the proposals, we have taken a stand on making sure that our children are well educated and have all the resources they need to meet their full potential. As we also need to make sure that our parents have all the information they need to be able to make decisions about the policy that impacts their children's education. It's just as important as who the teacher and who the principal are, as much as it is who's running the Chicago Public Schools from a governance perspective. So there are lots of competing models, as we'll hear tonight, a lot of information. So hopefully after tonight, you'll have a better handle as a parent on the various proposals. We are also trying to ensure tonight that we have a process where folks who may not be comfortable fully in English, or who may be limited English proficient, have the opportunity to see through a caption what we're saying. Now, because of technology, not everyone may be able to access the translation service tonight. So what we will do after this is we will run this through a service so that will translate and caption for those who were not able to use the system tonight, so that you can see the recording later where everyone's presentation will be captioned in Spanish. So thank you for the opportunity to present this to you. And now we will open the actual program. So Calmetta.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Calmetta Coleman. I am Executive Vice President of the Chicago Urban League, and I lead external affairs and programs for the league. So I will be delighted to be your moderator for this evening's discussion. We actually will start with an overview of the legislation, and we will hear from Juan Morado Jr., who will talk about the legislation that's out there, just to give everyone a bit of history and background. So Juan, I invite you now.
Well, Calmetta, I thank you for using the junior. My mother is very happy somewhere, because when I don't use the junior, she says, you must be talking about your father, and he's sitting here next to me. So I thank you for that. And it's a pleasure to be with everyone this evening to talk a little bit about the school board bills, and really what is going to possibly be a seismic shift in the way that our schools are governed here in the city of Chicago. As a student of history, I think it's always best for us to start with a little brief history on how we got to where we're at today. And so I'll begin by just laying out a little bit of a foundation for you. In 1872, the Illinois State Legislature, established a Board of Education with members appointed by the mayor to oversee all the aspects of public education in Chicago. Not until 1980 did the state then mandate the Chicago School Finance Authority, which was set up to exercise financial control over CPS, taking some of that authority away from the board. Fast forward 8 years, and the Illinois State Legislature passed the Chicago School Reform Act of 1988. This rewrote Article 34 of the Illinois School Code, the portion that deals specifically with the Chicago public school system. And what it did was it started to decentralize control of the school system and establish the election of local school councils at each Chicago public school. And those local school councils had the sole authority to select and evaluate principals, approve an annual school improvement plan, and help and develop and approve a school budget. The 1988 law also abolished the existing 11-member Board of Education. What it did was expand it to a board of 15 members and created a school board nominating commission composed of 23 parents and community representatives from local school councils across the city. And the five members who made up that commission were appointed by the mayor. That brings us to 1995, which was where we are at today. In 1995, the state legislature, with the support of Mayor Daley, passed the Chicago School Reform Amendatory Act. The act centralized control of CPS in the office of the mayor, giving them the sole authority over CPS, including eliminating the school finance authority, allowing the mayor the appointment of board members and top administrators, and allowing the mayor to then also appoint the board president. It also created the position of chief executive officer, who would oversee the CPS administration. The 1995 law, importantly, gave the mayor sole authority to appoint a 5-member school reform board to serve through 1999. And that's how we got to where we're at today. So as I think Marty mentioned, there's a couple of different bills out there that propose to change the way the Chicago public school system is operated. I'll start with Senate Bill 2497, which is currently in the Illinois Senate and is chief sponsor of Senator Robert Martwick. This bill calls for the creation of a 21-member board that will be elected by eligible voters in the city of Chicago, and the city will be divided into 20 electoral districts by the General Assembly. Now, you heard me say this is a 21-member board, so 20 of those districts will make up the majority of the board, and that one additional position is for the president of the board, and that will be an at-large election between all of the city's wards. The vice president of this entity will be elected by the board. The board will also be responsible for filling vacancies unless they wait longer than 45 days, at which point the mayor would have the ability to appoint someone to a vacancy. The initial board will serve a term of 5 years, with the election to happen in March 2022, and subsequently, there will be 4-year terms thereafter. These will be nonpartisan elections, and no member can serve on the board if they are a former employee of CPS, or if they are a former employee of CPS within a 1-year period of time, and if they have a contract with the school district. The other bill I wanted to talk a little bit about today is Senate Bill 827, which is proposed by Senator Kimberly Lightfoot. What this bill allows for is a transition from a 7-member board to a 11-member board by 2028. The 7-member board would have 5 appointed members by the mayor and 2 elected. And subsequently, when it transitions to an 11-member board, it would be 8 total appointed members and 3 elected. The appointed members would still be appointed by the mayor, 3 individuals to be elected at large. The city would be split up amongst these 3 districts to allow for the election of these individuals. These would be, the board president would be still selected by the mayor for a 2-year term. Like the other bill, the individuals who get to vote in this election are eligible voters. Individuals who can run include folks who have 2 years prior service on a local school council, or as a board member of a charter school within the last 10 years. Eligibility restrictions include, the restrictions include not allowing board members who are employees of CPS. There is also a 1-year revolving door prohibition on board members receiving business or compensation from the board more than $25,000. And the drawing of the districts would take place the first election would take place in May 2022. Importantly, there are term limits. There would be 2 4-year terms for all members. The one thing to keep in mind about both of these bills, I know Marty talked a little bit about the services that Casa Central provides, is that neither bill seems to allow for voting by undocumented parents of CPS students. So those are the 2 major bills that are out there. And Calmetta, I will turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Juan. We appreciate that background. It's very helpful. So at this point, I will actually introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Daniel Anello, who is CEO of Kids First Chicago. We also have Robin Steens, who's Executive Director of Advance Illinois, and Rod Wilson, Executive Director of the Eugenia Burns Hope Center. So I will ask each of our panelists to actually talk a little bit about their organization and the work that they do, and then to share a bit about their thoughts or perspective on some of the proposed legislation, as well as the school board models that Juan talked about. I will start with Robin.
Hi, delighted to be with everybody this evening. I am Robin Steens. I lead Advance Illinois, which is a bipartisan nonprofit education policy and advocacy organization. And it works to ensure all kids have equal opportunity to strong educational opportunities and outcomes. One of our signature things that we worked on is really building and leading the charge to put in place a new equitable funding formula for the state that's been in place for the last few years and has really done a terrific job of driving state dollars to the districts that need them most, certainly including Chicago. And just another bit of background, I am also a former Chicago public school teacher. I have served on 2 different local school councils, both as a community representative as well as a parent representative. And all 3 of my children attended neighborhood Chicago public schools from kindergarten till they abandoned me and fled the home. I also want to start by saying I'm not here to promote or defend either one of those pieces of legislation, but the way Advance Illinois does work when it deals with important issues, which this is sort of look at what the research and information tell us, think through what are the issues we ought to be keeping in mind, and try to decide how to proceed from there. And from where I sit, this is all very simple. And this is both from where I sit, I'm trying to advocate for all children as well as my own experience with CPS, which is that the guiding light of any decision that we're going to make about the governance of the 3rd largest school district in the country has got to be the educational health and well-being of the district's 350,000 plus students. What structures and elements, we should be asking ourselves, are most likely to generate the leadership and decision-making that our students need? And because what's good for our students is good for our schools, what's good for our schools is good for our city, that we hope will pay dividends far beyond. So what does the research say about the relative merits of elected versus appointed school boards? I want to start by saying, actually, the research on school boards is relatively thin. What research we have suggests that in a city the size of Chicago, because the truth is elections are quite different in a town of 10,000 or 40,000 or even 200,000 than when you get to a place the size of Chicago, where you're talking millions. And the evidence at that size, relatively thin. It suggests that appointed tends to get you more effective results in terms of student outcomes and performance, but it's thin. I will also say we were unable to find any research that one of the proposals is 21 members. I know you're going to hear more about that from Rod Wilson. It's very unusual to have a school board that size. Typically, school boards are between 7 to 9. It's extremely unusual to be larger than that. I know that the reason for that is to try to be more representative. What it does, however, is it tends to make it extremely difficult to make hard decisions. That's just a lot of people to come to grips. So could not find any research or evidence that suggests either that is common, or what level of a good idea that might be. Because the research is thin, the second thing that we looked at, and we would encourage you to look at, is, well, how is Chicago actually done? We've got our own experiment right here. We have had, as you heard Juan mention, various forms of appointed school boards over the years. And in 1995, we've had this version of mayoral control. So how have we done? And the reality is that Chicago's actually done extraordinarily well. Let me break that down. First, many of you may know over the past 25 years, the high school graduation rate. 25 years ago, if you entered high school, you were more likely to drop out than you were to graduate. Graduation rate was about 47%. Now we're right at 80%. And those are just numbers on a page. If you break that down and you look at the number of students involved, that's thousands and thousands of students every year who are graduating that would not have. Over the accumulated years, that is tens, hundreds of thousands of students. Because we know of the power of graduating, it's a very different trajectory you're on in terms of your likeliness to be employed, your lifetime earnings, your likelihood of going on and earning additional post-secondary degrees. So the life trajectory impact of that is profound. Every bit is important, and I think something that is known across the country and weirdly known less well here is the academic growth and progress that Chicago's actually made over the last 25 years. CPS, in a study done by Stanford researchers, they looked at academic progress. How much progress were students making, elementary students, while they were in school between 3rd grade and 8th grade, which is where we've got the best data. You'd expect a student to make 5 years of growth. Chicago students making 6 years of academic progress in 5 years. And to put that in frame of reference, that means that Chicago's growth exceeds that of 96% of districts across the country. I want to pause and I want to explain, not 96% of big city districts, not 96% of districts that have similar student population, 96% of all districts, including districts that are much better funded, have many more resources to bring to bear to their students, and have lower levels of need, which is pretty powerful and pretty profound. And I want to also make clear that that results are being driven by students from low-income families, by Black students, by Latinx students. In other words, there's not like one group is doing well and the other's doing better. In fact, the progress of our Latino students is over 6 years. They're actually beating the overall Chicago average that in turn is beating the country. So impressive and unusual is Chicago's progress that actually experts, researchers, and educational leaders from around the country have been studying Chicago in the last 5 years to try to understand how have they been getting this kind of growth and progress, what accounts for it, and how can they copy it. So when we talk about changing how we govern the district, I pause on that because that's what's at stake. We have actually been doing something that's very unusual and difficult to do, and doing it very steadily over a sustained period of time. And it has redounded to pretty serious improvements for our students. Now, I recognize I am a longtime Chicago parent, I'm a former teacher, I work in and around schools all the time. That data sometimes feels very disconnected from the lived experience of those of us who have lived or worked within CPS, where sometimes it can feel like it is a big bureaucracy, it can feel chaotic. There are decisions that are made, school closing is incredibly difficult. at the neighborhood and the level. It feels disconnected from people's needs and realities. So you've got a challenge that very real progress and growth has to be balanced against the very real needs for parents to feel like they are being heard on decisions that are profound for them, their families, and their neighborhood. I think that's entirely right and understandable. So at the same time, we want to make sure that there is greater representation and voice. We also want to make sure that we are doing that in a way that preserves the growth and the progress that has been so beneficial to so many students. So the question from our mind is, what are the issues we should be paying attention to? And let me just quickly say, we want to make sure we preserve what is good. And some of the things that are good about the current system, we have an overall size of the board. There are 7 members that permits and facilitates decision-making. We've got hard decisions to make. 21 members, which is one of the proposals, even the 11 in the other proposal, those are large groups trying to come together and be coherent and consistent over a period of time. That's tough. So size matters. Second, you want to be able to stay the course on decisions over time. So anything we should look for, whatever structure we have, is our group going to be able to come together as a board and stay together for a period of time to make decisions and then to stay with them. One of the hardest things in big city districts is when you've got turnover, not just of leadership, but of board direction. You don't want gridlock, you don't want chaos, and you don't want to be zigzagging between different strategies over time. That's not good for kids. You want the ability to coordinate across city agencies. I think one of the things that has been beneficial about the last 25 years, sometimes harder to see, is the ability to coordinate between the schools, the park districts, the libraries, arts programming, both during the school year and the summer. So you'd like to find a way to preserve that. There are pretty significant city subsidies. You want to preserve those because we continue to be deeply underfunded as a district. You want to ensure that there is relevant expertise. It's a complicated system. You want to make sure that you've got both the financial expertise, the educational expertise, the community grounding at any given point in time, as well as other pieces, excuse me. And then finally, you want to preserve the clarity of knowing who to hold responsible. I don't think anybody who's lived through the last few mayoral elections believes that education, schools, and decisions wasn't a pretty significant part of that mayoral election campaign. And then, excuse me, that's what you want to preserve that's good. There are a couple of concerns that any new system we want to make sure mitigates. Concern number one, how you run the election. We can run the election through the Board of Elections, which limits who can run and who can vote. You could run the election through the Chicago Public Schools, which is how we run the local school council elections. Local school council elections permit a broader array of parents to vote and to run. That's something worth considering. Second, you want to be clear that there are clear campaign finance restrictions. This is big money. This is not like voting in a small town where everybody knows who's running or they know someone who knows them. We're a city of millions. The Los Angeles School District is an elected school board. They spent over $15 million in the last election. $15 million. So I think when we talk about voting, we all want to know that it's going to be the neighbor down the street and the parent across the way that's going to be running and that's going to be elected. When you talk about that kind of money coming in, that's going to make it very difficult for an average run-of-the-mill parent or citizen or community leader to run and to run accessibly. It's going to become about special interest. We ought to make sure that anything that we do puts in safeguards, pretty stringent ones about that. Finally, I think we need to keep in mind that voter turnout for school board elections everywhere in the country, literally everywhere in the country and all around Illinois, extraordinarily low. So it's usually between 6 to 9%. If you get 9%, that's actually a pretty good year, which again is going to drive who runs, who votes, and who's elected. So I think we want to keep in mind that any decision we make, Chicago, one of the things that people say, like, it's elected everywhere else. And I'm not arguing against there being I'm an elected posse at all. I think we're going to need to do that. I think, though, that one of the realities is that Chicago isn't like every other district in Illinois because we've got local school councils. We have locally elected school councils for every single school in the city. There isn't another district in the state that has that. I don't know if there's another district in the country that does. So we have an elective process. There's some ability for voice. It's not the same as doing that at the level, but it means that we might want to find ways to build into that process so that we can try to build support for the elective process so that we are not having massive and important decisions made by a very small subset of the electorate that turns itself out. So there are lots of ways that we could restructure this. You've got two already on the docket. Either one may or may not be the right prototype as it is. We hope that people will continue to talk and find a balanced strategy that preserves what's been very good and powerful and productive for students over the last 25 years, but recognizes we need more voice, we need more representation, and finds a way to marry those two. 350,000 and more students that depend on that. Thanks.
So much, Robin. So we'll now turn to Rod Wilson to talk a little bit about the Eugenia Burns Hope Center and to share his perspective. Rod?
Thank you for having me today. Eugenia Burns Hope Center is a nonprofit community-based organization that focuses on increasing the civic capacity of Bronzeville and other residents. And all that really means is how do we help community residents, empower them to make decisions for their own community. Instead of many times in Black communities, we are have to deal with decisions other people make, but we're not at the table, not just with voice, but with decision-making power. And so that's what we work with residents on. I'm also a LSC facilitator and trainer. I participated in 2 LSCs over the last 20 years. I am a parent. We also work on policy around local school councils, policy on affordable housing. How do we help those who tend to be marginalized, help empower them to begin to take control of their community? And so given that, the elected school board, we support, SB 2497. We think that is the best representative bill for elected school board. I myself helped facilitate the first citywide referendum in November 2012 around elected school board. And I appreciate a lot of the comments that Robin made, but there's 2 sides to every coin. We know that, under mayor control, first, this is about democracy, representation, equity. As a colleague of mine, the Shannon Bennett, the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization always says, equity begins with governance. It begins with governance. Those who are disenfranchised, we're talking equity, they have to be at the table to talk about how we can get equity. It can't be someone else deciding that. So first, every school district that has mayoral control is in a Black and brown school district, except one across the whole country. This is about equity. So every school district where there is mayoral control is in a Black or brown school district, with exception of one. If this was so great of an idea, it would be in other districts outside of Black and brown. Secondly, every school district in the state of Illinois has an elected school board, except Chicago. Chicago is a majority of students of color, Black and brown. And to say that we need to have a mayoral control or some type of hybrid where the mayor still has the most voting power is quite insulting, because it's saying that Black and brown parents can't make the educational decisions for their children when they have the most at stake here. Every other school district can do it, from Salem, Illinois, Centralia, Sauget, Danville, Champaign-Urbana, Normal, Bloomington, all these other school districts can do it. But when it comes to Chicago, we got to have something different. Now, I will admit, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods. And like Robert mentioned, it is a large city, and it is a segregated city as well. So that's why, with the 20 districts, the more districts you have, the more representation people have. With the smaller school board, people have less representation. We have a city of 50 aldermen. And again, this also is a little different when you look at having so many people and it's gridlock. Chicago has a 50 aldermen, they make decisions all the time. The state legislature has 118 House members, they make decisions all the time. The Senate has 59 members, they make decisions all the time. The US Congress has 435. I mean, we can say that having a larger body will make it difficult, but we have all these examples where it happens all the time. Is it challenging? It is, but that's part of it. That's part of having a democracy, having all these different opinions there to have that tension to get to the best thing that works for everybody. Because when you got it coming from one place, we get what we have gotten. In mid 2000s, we had 100 some odd school closures. Yeah, you can say that we have gains, but what's not talked about is a 600% increase in alternative schools. That's not considered in that graduation rate. What's not talked about, and anecdotally, is schools that were closed. Case in point, Future Commerce had 100% graduation rate. They were closed to give CHA land. So an educational decision was made to close a school that had 100% graduation rate so that CHA could have some land right on Wellington Lake Park. I knew 5 students that went to that school. When the school was closed, they had to get transferred to Phillips School, which is in a different neighborhood. They got jumped on a few times. They dropped out of school. Those type of things are realities we deal with every day. And we brought this to the board. The Douglas Elementary School on the south side, CPS used test scores from Douglas High School on the west side to validate closing Douglas School. When it was brought to their attention, they still closed the school. That's what happens when you have the decision-making authority coming from one place, because they have one agenda and they don't care about all the other things. We came to many board members saying, stop it. And the only reason I'm bringing this up because I'm really talking about mayoral control and how people have no voice in that. With an elected school board, it's like any other election, just like the one we had for president in 2016. If people don't like or don't have the representation in that office, there's another election in 2020. If we get a board that does not represent us, we have another election. With mayoral control, we don't get that. We have to accept whatever decisions that are made, even if they're not in our best interest. So this is about democracy. This is about representation. This is about equity. 20-member board, we have 50 wards in the city of Chicago. So with a 20-member board, you almost have 2 wards for every district. That is a reasonable size for a parent like me to be able to run for an election. If you have less districts, that means those areas are going to be a lot larger. And you're talking about campaign finance, you're talking about money being put into the race. That's when you're going to really get a lot more money influencing the races, the larger the districts are. Our first iteration of looking at elected school board was a 13-member board, but when we talked to groups on the west side, they felt, and the far south in the South Chicago, they felt like they weren't being represented. And so that's how we end up getting to a 20-member board. We've been working on this for 12 to 15 years easily. So it's nothing new, and it's not like we haven't looked at this from every angle, looked at Milwaukee, looked at LA, looked at different cities and all that. But a 20-member board, because Chicago City and neighborhoods, it is a segregated city, it does allow people to have some real voice in who represent them at the on education decision. Voter turnout, I agree. Voter turnout is low. And sometimes, it's lower, sometimes no, but that's always the challenge with democracy. But that doesn't mean we run away from it. That means we embrace it, we lean into it. We have to get more people engaged. And if they have some say in their educational decisions for their children, they will be engaged. We got to make sure that there is an effort to make sure we promote the elections. Local school councils, many times, I'm a local school council facilitator, there's no promotion for it. People don't even know when elections are happening. If our organization, community-based organization, weren't really out there pushing it, sometimes it wouldn't get the turnout it does. So we got to get beyond that. We got to make sure that we have the mechanism in place to make sure people have the opportunity to be engaged so they can make those decisions for their children. We looking at having the board decide the election versus the Board of Elections, CPS board versus Board of Elections. The only problem with CPS board having the elections is that if the CPS board it's a conflict of interest to have a governing body run their own elections. Yes, it would allow for those who are undocumented to participate, and we're totally for that. We even have a trailer bill, or we support a trailer bill that supports those undocumented being able to participate, just like local school councils. But if we're over at the board of election, a board of CPS board, and we're also running the elections, there can be a conflict of interest there. So these are things we've looked at inside and out. Campaign finance, I totally agree with that. But there is no campaign finance nowhere in Illinois. So I think it's something that should be another trailer bill, but it should not be a thing that stops us from having that democracy. So we feel like some things need to be in there, but we can't wait 5-10 years to build enough power to push the Illinois General Assembly, because these decisions are made in Springfield, not in Chicago, and be held without an elected school board. And when given the history, one thing you didn't hear was not once did Chicago ever had an elected school board. And so we believe that parents, just like in other decisions for their family, are the experts on what their children may need. They know what hurts their children. When I know we was telling CPS that if you close the school and have these children go there, there's going to be violence. They didn't listen because they were not accountable to us. They were accountable to the 5th floor. We need to end that because it works for some, it doesn't work for the others. Chicago has an inequitable education system. The schools in Lincoln Park and Rogers Park are not the same as schools in North Lawndale and Austin. They don't even have the same curriculums. That's inequity. And that's been there. It's nothing new. It's been like that. So all these 25, 30, 50 years, it's been the same way. We need something different. In order to get something different, we have to do something different. Let's let the parents, the community members, let's let people decide who they want to represent them. And again, this is not a panacea. Let's be clear about that. But if we get someone in office that does not represent us, then we can vote that person out in 4 years. But right now, the board we have no control of that board, none at all. We can't do anything to get rid of school board. Only person that can is the mayor. And this isn't about the current mayor. This is about setting up a system that works beyond this mayor, beyond the next one and the next one after that. We want to make sure we have a system that's accountable to the people of Chicago.
Thank you, Rod. Before we move to our next panelist, I just want to mention a few housekeeping things. So as most of you can probably, well, all of you should be able to see, probably at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. And so if you have questions, you'll be able to pose those and we'll be monitoring those to check them for our panelists. And once everyone has sort of shared remarks, we will have a Q&A session. And then just as a reminder to the panelists who are able, because I keep forgetting myself, to make sure that we're using the translation streamer service before we speak so that it translates for us. And then for those who joined us late, Marty shared at the beginning that for the speakers who you cannot see Spanish translation for, we will be converting the entire recording to Spanish following this event, and that will be available to people who need that. So at this time, I want to invite Daniel Anello to talk a bit about Kids First Chicago and to share his perspectives on the school board options. Daniel.
Yeah, thank you. And let me set up the streamer so you can see the translation. So thanks. It's nice to be here tonight, and I appreciate having a chance to sit down with Rod before. I'm formerly lived in Bronzeville myself, but at some point we're gonna have to find time to break bread after this. And good to see my fellow panelist, Robin Staines as well. So I'll start by saying I agree 100% with the notion of who needs to be at the table to shape and think about what the future school board should look like with Rod. And, you know, I come back to this notion of who's directly impacted and just my own experience with my parents and what they knew and what they didn't know and how that affected my own schooling, my brothers, and the work that we do at Kids First Chicago. For those of you who do not know us, and I invite you to please come to get to know us, is we come to every issue without a position. We have an intentionally very, very diverse team, and that includes diversity in terms of what neighborhoods they come from in Chicago and what they might think about the various different options for a school board in the future. And we divorce ourselves of position, and we have a really robust conversation with as many families that represent the school district as possible. And so that is what we've done on every issue from, trying to, and from there we elevate what those issues are and try to see real change happen. So whether it was the work on the internet to bring free internet to families across Chicago right after the pandemic, making the high school application process more accessible by making it one, or this issue, if there's a big issue that needs to be discussed, our job is not to have a position, but to learn what families and parents want. And so we started this conversation more recently. I know that there's been a lot of conversation over the years about whether or not binary, we want an elected board or the appointed structure. Our work is very much framed in the literature and philosophy of Paulo Freire. So it gets really at the heart of how do we unpack all of these issues and provide as much information as possible so that people can make really informed decisions. And Rod, you said there's kind of two sides to every coin. I actually would argue that there's more than that. And so in our conversations in 10 workshops, they weren't focus groups, they weren't panel discussions, they weren't surveys, they were much more robust with deep information, research provided, and hearing back from families from across the city. We had over 300 parents represented in those workshops. We would continue to expand beyond that. But we heard back, and we heard from people that had very strong opinions and views like Rod here around the 21 member. We heard from people that felt like the system should stay the same, and we heard from everything in between. And I'll share a little bit about where they landed, but I think it's really important to just note the big items that they really wanted to see, which I think Rod hit on, which was representation. And for them, representation, for the parents we talked to, representation really meant a school board that looked like the students in the schools themselves, not necessarily the city of Chicago, because we know Chicago is about a third white, brown, black, with a small percentage of other populations, including Asian. And when you look at the school district, it's almost 50% Latinx. The next biggest population is the Black population, and then it's about 10% white and 4% Asian. And so when they think about a school board, when parents are talking about it and they thought about kids who are in the school board, that is a very big decision, because when you think about districting in an elected structure, it can't, in the way election politics work and who can be elected when it's run by the state, you can't necessarily control for who runs for school board, who gets elected. And if those districts are represented a third across the city, that is probably not going to look like the population of the students that are in the school district. And that can have massive effect on equity issues. If we're talking about equitable funding at the state level, and we think about equitable funding here in Chicago, which I would argue we need to start really putting our foot down on, how do we bring more resources to Black and brown students in low-income communities that need it? It is much harder to do that if the school board does not represent the kids in the school district. And so those are some of the consequences of us not actually having these deeper order questions versus, do you want an elected board or you want an appointed board? And so what came out of the discussion was that the parents, at the end of the day, and we ran these 10 sessions, and actually one of the sessions was run by 2 of our moms that are in our network. And they had 70 parents in their session, 50 respondents. And one of them I know is very pro 21 member, the Martwick bill that's out there today. And the other one is very pro elected board as well. And at the end of the day, they got the same results that you're about to hear from me. The majority of parents that aren't on the polls, when we show up without a position and we just listen and really try to understand what their position is, land somewhere in the middle. They want a balanced board. And when they say balanced, they're talking about an even number of board members, elected and appointed. And I know that there's a history of who has elected and who has appointed structures, and maybe it's a little Pollyannish to think that we can come up with something better, but I do think that we need to push for the utopia here, because I don't think that electoral politics have always represented our communities. And I think that there's an opportunity for us to think differently when we think about this school board. And I feel like the people who are directly impacted are speaking. And so they're saying they want something with even membership. And they talked about finance control because they're worried about who can actually run for these elections. They recognize that there's low turnout, but there's an opportunity from a standpoint of how you run these elections. So I know Rod mentioned the LSC structure or the timing. Can you run the election through CPS? There are ways for us to think about running the elections differently for the elected seats that open the door to both undocumented and non-citizens who are in Chicago whose kids are in the schools, and also allow for tighter controls around electoral spending. They want parents that look like them, as I shared, on the school board, but they really want to make sure that there's parents on the school board. And so there's a lot of discussion around at least half the school board members should be people like us who have our kids in these schools, because then they're accountable to what happens in these schools. And finally, from an accessibility standpoint, I think, well, we hit on the money, non-citizens. I think the biggest thing here is the question around the purity of democracy and representation, because they are not always the same thing. And we have to find a way to make democracy work. And when you actually have a robust dialogue with parents, they tell you that the way to make it work in this instance is to have something more balanced, where there's accountability at the city and there's accountability from an electoral standpoint for board members, and they basically balance each other out. And so that is the model that they default to in aggregate. And from there, they start to move into more electoral type structures, with frankly, the 21 member board being the last option on the list, at least of the conversations we've had, given its size. There are other models that have been more popular with the parents that we've been engaged with. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Daniel. So with that, I think we will start a sort of a round of questions. Each of you have done such a great job of sharing your perspective and also giving some of an overview of some of the really key issues. But I want to start, for people who may have come on later, to just sort of to kind of reframe kind of why this conversation is important for parents. So whichever way school boards are selected, they make important decisions that impact the students who attend Chicago public schools. So can you talk some about the ways that CPS parents can actually weigh in on those kinds of decisions? I know we talked about the local school councils and some other things, but what are the ways now with the school board for parents to weigh in on the decisions that the board makes? Why don't I start with Rod, since he's been on the local school council?
I think, again, there's weighing in. It could be giving your opinion on what needs to happen, but I think I'm speaking of something different. I'm speaking of how do we have decision-making power, which are two different things. When we first went through the first round of school closings, we went to board meetings. They did whatever they unanimously, they closed schools. Then we said, okay, we need to have more voice. So we went to the state, came up with the process where they had to have hearings, and the hearings were done, but they were checklists, and they still closed schools unanimously. That's us trying to have voice. This is beyond that. Now I think we need to have some type of decision-making authority, and the only place I see that is in local school councils. And even in there, CPS still pulls back some of the power, LSCs, if the school is on probation. They can't make a decision on a CIWP. They can't on a school improvement plan. They can't approve the budget. They can't approve the principal. And that's been in place since the Mandatory Act as well. And it was always been a thing of CPS trying to pull back some of the powers from local school councils and from parents. So when you ask about weighing in, there's always a way to weigh in. You can always go to a board meeting, write a letter. You can give your opinion, but to have real power is something different. And the only place you have that in local school councils, and even in there, you got appointed LSCs who are just they're just advisory. So there are still these instances where that power is taken away. And again, which goes back to our concern of we deserve the same rights and responsibilities as everyone else. We should be given that. We shouldn't have to have a model where the mayor has more or even number of appointed members. We believe that real accountability will work with an elected board. It's hard to hold a mayor accountable. It is, because the mayor is responsible for the housing, healthcare, police, public safety, education. They may be horrible in education, but good in all the other areas. It's hard to get them out of office. That's the only way we can hold them accountable. So if you have a group that's solely focused on the schools, now you can hold them accountable to education issues. Anyone appointed, every opportunity or every instance where we have anyone appointed, they are beholden to the people who appointed them, which is the mayor. In CHA and CPS, it's all the same. So there is no reason, none, for us to have an appointed school board unless we want to keep being beholden to the mayor and have the mayor, whoever's at that fifth floor, making decisions for us. Every instance is always the same. So it just baffles me, because everyone we talk to, we work with organizations across the city. When
Rod, I want to give Robin a chance to jump in there. It looks like she wants to talk about ways that the parents can weigh in.
So, yeah, I want to jump in and also build on Rod's point, because I think he's right to say there are lots of ways to have input. Those are a little bit different than, having decision-making authority and the accountability that comes with it. I think that's right to distinguish those. Local school councils do have the ability to hire and fire principals and to approve budgets and school improvement plans. But, Rod is also right that there are instances where that can be pared back. But I do think accountability and just cuts both ways. I think what's challenging is, I think right now there's clarity. We all know if you don't like the fact that schools were closed, you know exactly who to blame for that. You know exactly where to go for that. You know exactly what to do for that. It was a powerful factor in mayoral elections the last few times, decisions and things that were going on in schools. I think the challenge, particularly with 21 member board, is there's going to be a lot of this, right? I mean, who am I holding responsible? I mean, it's 21 members. So I think it's going to be extremely, I get what you're saying, Ron. I actually don't think that's how it's going to play out. I actually think there is more clarity, more direction when you've got one person on the hook than when you've got, 21 on a complicated array of issues and the ability to go sideways. That's my fear.
Could I jump in real quick?
Well, let me first see if Daniel has anything he wants to
Rod,
add.
you go as long as I get a chance.
You're ceding your time to Rod, or?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm postponing my time for Rod.
All right, not ceding it, right? Heather, I think I disagree, respectfully disagree. I think if I'm living in a district and my elected official on that 21-member board does not represent me, that's the person I hold accountable. And I vote that person out. It's easier for me to vote out an alderman than it is a mayor. And you're talking about finances, you're talking about millions of dollars in the mayoral race. So yeah, and again, my other point is that, yeah, being bad on schools is one thing, but they're good on other issues. Again, with a mayor, it's harder to hold them accountable for that one thing. But if I got a district representative on that school board and they're not representing me, then I can write a letter, I can go to them, but the next election I can vote them out. So
and then if I can, I know Daniel's the one who goes next, but I'm totally,
I'm talking about my representative, just like alderman, just like state rep, just like US rep, we have democracy. We got the models. We're acting like those models don't work. And we have to make them work. That's on us.
But one other thing I would just add into this, and I know this time really belongs to Daniel, is, and again, as I said before, I wish there were a more robust body of literature and research on school boards. But one of the things that has been looked at is where, particularly in large districts, you have an elected school board, and those are regionally based, which is what you're talking about here. The 21 members, right? You've got districts all around the city. You can elect from there. You go big because you want to have more representation. They tend to have weaker outcomes, that there is a correlation between that regional, because you've got people, to your point, who are responding with that you're balkanizing decision-making, and that you're not looking at the good of the whole of the district. And so again, I think the tension here is between, there are multiple things that you want to do. You want representation, you want accountability. You also want to know that you're making decisions that are for the well-being of the district as a whole, for all students, and that you can then see progress as a result of that. So I would just name that the research on that suggests that there are some problems there too.
Okay, I can push back. I'm gonna go ahead and let Daniel do his thing. Go ahead.
Thanks, man. So I just want to say, we can point to plenty of examples too where democracy is not working exactly like it should. And I want to talk a little bit about I think going back to the original question, just about how engaged or how much people can weigh in, how parents can weigh in real time. Rod's right. Like, we don't have a process right now that defers voice and power enough to the parents and the people who are directly impacted in school systems. I am not convinced that, and this is I'm a firm believer in democracy, Rod, but because our model is listen to the people who are directly impacted and form our position around that, that is where we landed on this balanced model. It's not coming from me. I'm not showing up with that position. I'd have a very different opinion if I was going to share one. But I'm sharing the voices of the families that we work with. And I do think that we have a very representative Chicago sample of families and parents from across the city. And so one of the things I think is really hard is for even this room to divorce ourselves of what our positions are and say, okay, what do the masses of parents across the city really want? And to step away from those positions is not easy. It means working in deference to communities, but to kind of think through the impact of democratic structures in our country, and to say, hey, we have to allow ourselves to continue to allow democracy to work the way it has and accept that that's just the way it's going to be. So let's have a democratic process by instating a fully elected board when A, parents aren't saying they want that on the mass, and B, thinking about democracy and how it's worked in this country. I mean, the decision right now for whether or not we're going to have whatever the board's going to look like is being made outside of Chicago. That's not democracy. The directly impacted people in Chicago as citizens should be able to make that decision. We've had popular elections where people have been elected and yet we get stuck with someone else, right? And the consequences of that are pretty severe too. And if you're going to have 9%, if you're lucky, 12% of people show up for an election, the data that are across this country that show what we see white voters, we see white people get elected in districts that are predominantly Black and brown. And decision-making does not follow a representative or equitable kind of pathway when you have that kind of layout. And so one of the things I think that's been really critical that parents have kind of brought to the surface is that's why they need a balance. That's why they're looking for something that gives them both the opportunity to hold the mayor accountable and to hold those elected people accountable in the way that you're describing. Yes, we can vote them out, but how do you make sure those people who are elected look like me? Well, I need the mayor to make sure that the board on a whole looks like me.
And I hear that. I definitely hear that. I think that it's a couple of things. One, when we're looking at, I feel like I'm going back and forth.
Well, so Rod, let's do this because we have quite a number of questions in the Q&A and in the chat. So I want to make sure that we can give some of our guests, our attendees, a chance to weigh in. I'm going to combine one that I see in the chat with one that was also on my mind. We've talked about both, the elected option and the appointed option, but I'd like to talk for a minute or get your perspective on just what should the qualifications be, whether elected or appointed, or a member of the school board. Like what are the qualifications that we should be looking for in those individuals?
Okay.
Shall I go in alphabetical order?
However you want to go.
Daniel.
So again, I'm just going to repeat what I've heard from the conversations that we've had with the network of parents we work with, but the qualifications, first and foremost, parents. They want people that is a qualification that I think often gets underappreciated. But when your kids are in the school building, not only are you a taxpayer, so you're accountable to what happens in the city in education here, but you also literally have skin in the game. That's number one. I think number two is making sure that the parents who are on the board have the demographic representation that represents the school district is what we continue to hear time and again from parents. So I know I'm a little bit of a broken record on those two things, but that is incredibly important. And then after that, I think you start getting to some of the big expertise pieces that parents are very aware of, which is we have a school board budget that's $8.5 billion. And there's a tremendous amount of money kind of moving in and out and going to different places. There are some very challenging conversations around the corner that we have to think about. There's a ton of federal money that's coming in. And how do you think about how those dollars are going to be allocated to ensure that kids have an opportunity coming out of this pandemic to have the best quality education possible and to also think about what they may not have gotten this past year, right? And so in order to do that, those decisions have to be made at the board level. And representation at the board there is going to be important, but so is the expertise to navigate some of those complex financial questions. And that's not the only expertise. I think the academic expertise, our parents talked a lot about the different academic expertise that was necessary, special learners, making sure the diverse learners have someone who's on the school board that represents them. But ultimately, you know, the first place to start is to make sure that people who understand what it means to be in CPS with their children is where I would start.
Thanks, Daniel. Rod, in 1.5 minutes or less.
I think it should be an open process. I think, you know, the less restrictions, the better. But I think their schools are definitely for parents and for students and impact parents, but they're community institutions that we've been moving away from that over the last 30 and 40 years, because how good the school is will tell me will also impact how good my neighborhood is. How, not just values. I'm just saying what type of person is being produced for my community. So I don't think it should just be parents, but I do think parents should be on there. Definitely, I think they should have the right. But if parents don't want to, and the community members, they should have the right too. Again, I think it works in every other city. It works in every other place, but we're trying to make it seem like folks in Chicago can't make those decisions. And that's, again, is going back to insulting. And just one other thing I want to say, tell Daniel, I didn't say this, but this is just not my opinion. Again, I've talked to thousands of parents and community members, and they want an elected school board. Now, I have been in situations where people have talked about an appointed school board, and what they always start with is elections don't work. And then people tend to say, well, let me think about it. But elections don't work because we don't make them work. When we do make them work, when we get good voter turnout, we get folks that we want to see. But this is just not Rod's opinions. It's not me divorcing myself from my opinion. This is about what people in our community, people in other communities, when I knocked on doors and talked with folks, this is what they told us. And again, this is over a decade of activism, not just the last 6 months or a year. So I'm sorry.
Robin, did you want to add anything before we go to the
I don't think I have much to add to this one. I think we should move on.
All right. So I'll turn to a question from Erica Mendez with the Latino Policy Forum. She's asking, what is the status of the trailer bill that will allow non-citizen parents to participate in the process? Can either of you answer that or respond to that?
So I don't know if anybody else knows, but I know State Senator Selena Villanueva sponsored the bill. It's in the Senate. I think what's been handled right now is been waited to see what happen with the elected school board bill. Then that bill will be started to move. Right now, I think it's on pause to the other thing, till this whatever we come up with for elected school board will be decided upon.
Thank you. This one is directly for Daniel, and hopefully will be a quick one. Daniel, is there some place to go to read the Kids First report that you mentioned earlier from the focus groups?
Yes, I'll grab it. I don't have it on hand. I'll grab it and I'll drop it into the chat. People can see it and data. And to be clear, Rod, just to circle back on the one piece, not to belabor it, but I'm not saying that people don't want an elected, because that is the fallback option that came from, the parent workshops that we did. But one of the things that I think is important here is the distinction between an elected school board and a 21-member school board with 20 districts and one citywide position. So that is part of this discussion as well. We've seen that.
Those are two different things. I just want to be clear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two different things.
So another question that I will pose to you, Robin, that I think you might be able to answer is, are there any examples of Illinois districts where elected school boards have driven improvement in student achievement or improvements in equity?
Yeah, there's actually a great example, and we're Dr. Carmen Ayala, who is actually the state superintendent, used to lead the district North Berwyn, and they are they're an outstanding district in terms of both growth and in terms of narrowing achievement gaps and really promoting equity. So they're a standout elected board. But again, I want to say that CPS, and I make it sound like, again, I think the answer here is that you're wanting to find some sort of balance between elective pressures and what an appointed board and the clarity that brings can do. Because while I think North Berwyn, for example, is a great case in point, Chicago has outperformed basically every district in the state in terms of the academic growth of its students. And that's even before you get to the raised graduation rate. It is lifted. So the state overall has been improving its performance. And if you peel that back, that's been driven in huge part by Chicago Public Schools. So not to say that there is a need for change, but you just don't want to lose that. But certainly there are other examples, and North Berwyn's a great one.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you for that, Robin. And there's a second question that's specifically for Rod that I think is very related to that one, which Rod, you mentioned earlier in your conversation that, you know, it works in other districts, meaning an elected school board. And this person is an anonymous attendee, just says that schools have problems across the country, most of all, a massive and growing gap in achievement and opportunity for students of color. So what exactly, you know, do you have in mind when you say it works?
What I mean is, I think when people talk about an elected school board in Chicago versus the mayor appointing folks versus have 21-member board, they talk as if the sky is going to fall out. That's the point I'm making. I'm just saying that this is a model that is across the country, and the sky hasn't fell out. Yeah, do we have to, with any type of democracy, it only works if we make it work. That's it. And so our job as citizens is to tell, or people who live in this community, is to tell folks how to represent us. Their job is to do it. If we don't do our job, we can't expect them to do theirs. That's at a school board level, that's at an automatic level, that's a state representative, so on and so forth. And all I'm saying is that democracy works when we make it work. I think we can't say that, yeah, it's 9%, 11%, which is not an accurate look at the turnout levels for elections. But again, it works when we make it work, and we have to, and that's a challenge that we do have, but it doesn't mean we run away from it. It doesn't mean we say we need to get rid of all our aldermen and just let the mayor make the decision. We need to get rid of our state reps and let the governor make the decisions. We know we fight through it and we work through it, not say, let's get rid of our representation, our representatives, because then who has our voice? Because again, whoever's appointed is going to have the voice of the mayor. And again, that might be contrary to what we may need in Black and brown communities, which it has been in many instances. And I gave just a few of those. And those were, I mean, my last point, I'm gonna be done with this. We were talking to the head of the school board. They told us that in our neighborhood, it was the head of CHA who was making the decisions of what schools to close. That's what you get when you have an appointed school board. One person who makes the decisions for everything. Why is the head of CHA making decisions about what schools to close? That's not education, that's a housing market issue, because they were looking at how do we want to gentrify communities and incoming gentry staying, and again, not just to be labored upon a school closing, but I think it's a good representation of what we get when we have mayoral control. We get one person making all the decisions about everything, and we have not even a voice. We have no way to change that. That's all. And I'll let it be.
Thank you, Rod. So I'm going to go to another question, and I don't want to butcher this person's name that's in the Q&A. I want to say it's Samay Jiwali. I may be pronouncing that wrong, so I apologize for that. But the question is, have elected school boards had the same level of corruption that we have seen in Chicago? We have repeated examples of appointed CEOs lining their pockets or pushing political agendas of big donors. Then they go on to name some folk. But I think the basic question is, which is something else that I had on my mind as well, like, you know, how do you minimize corruption in either option? If you have some ideas that you want to share on that.
I mean, you got corruption everywhere. I mean, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools went to jail. So it's like that's under mayoral control, CPS. I mean, you're gonna have corruption where that can be there. You can't. I don't know if making an elected appointed is going to decide whether it's corruption or not. I think having a engaged base can provide some accountability around it. When people are not looking, people tend to do things behind people's back. If everybody's looking, it's less likely of that. And if everybody and if you got someone in there doing something and you don't have any say so, what can you really do? Otherwise, you can just vote that person out and bring somebody else in. I mean, so I think you can get corruption anywhere. That corruption is really, Yeah, it's a systemic piece, but it's also around the people. But we've seen that in Chicago, in Illinois, all across. So I don't know.
Does anyone want to add to that?
I mean, I'll just say that I think that there needs to be just far more transparency in order. I think the cut to Rod's point, whether it's appointed or elected board members, like corruption is one of those things that comes with, it's part of our universe. I also think like I don't want to use the term Pollyannish, but Rod, like one of the things I worry about is lack of decision-making power exists in so many different places, and it has a deeper root than whether we have democratic like electoral processes or not, right? We have plenty of places where there's elected boards where bad things have happened to Black and brown communities. So, you know, how do we mitigate against some of those things? And to me, this hits on both of those, is how do you make the systems more transparent to everyone so that we know what's going on?
I agree with that. I agree with transparency, definitely. And again, like I said before, it's not a panacea. You know, systems set up to be, you can set up the best system, but they all operated by people. And that's where the human factor comes in. And that's where corruption can come in, or mismanagement, or bad decisions. That's just part of this. But at least you can have a change if you don't like the representation with an election.
Robin, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, but I'll go to the next question. This is from Moretta Brown Miller. She asks, if we cannot get the parents to come out and attend our LSC, CAC, PTA, and school board meetings, how do you expect them to govern as an elected school board? A lot of time goes into being on these boards and committees. What will happen when people want to get paid for their time as a board member? Show of hands, Daniel.
I'll jump in. This is a question that, you know, part of our workshops is trying to get to those deeper order, like what are people thinking? And one of the questions we asked was, we shared with them what compensation looks like across the country in terms of school boards and who's on them, particularly in urban districts. And it was unanimous or predominant, like the majority definitely wanted to see some sort of compensation. And the main reason being, like, this is, you know, for some of the school board members, I think they tell you now, even, you know, under the current structure, it's 40 hours a week. It's a full-time job. There's a lot of work that comes with it. And to think that anyone should just be required to commit their time at that level without any kind of compensation seems a little unfair. And so we asked a question about whether or not they should get compensated, and we asked a question about where they thought they should get compensated. LA, for example, pays their board members $125,000 a year. Florida is more like in the 40,000s for many of their school districts. And what we heard was between 25 to 40 based on the conversations we had with parents.
Yeah, I mean, we've had different iterations of a school board bill. I think one of ours did have compensation, and we wanted that in there. We feel that, I agree with Daniel, that you're given a lot of time. I do think that, I think it was taken out of our bill because when you go downstate, when you go outside of Chicago, well, we don't have an elected school board, but when you go to other places throughout the state, they don't pay their school board members. So the legislators, again, and then I go back to one of Daniel's points, is it fair that the whole General Assembly of Illinois decides on what happened with Chicago schools? Because some of the legislators wouldn't support a bill that had compensation for elected school board members because in their district, they didn't have that. Is it right? It's not right. Is it the reality we living in right now? It's the reality. So yeah, so I think they should get compensated. I do. It's not in our bill because, again, we were focused on how do we bring an elected school board to Chicago? How do we give parents, the community members, anybody who wanted to be on the board, an opportunity to be on that board without having some of those things, those items in it that's going to stop it from happening altogether. And we figure we can always make it better. We can always, you know, fine tune it, but it was a non-starter in the state. So we were like, okay, but I agree. I think they should be compensated because it is a lot. It is a lot, definitely.
I would just chime in to say the same. It's an incredibly important responsibility. I mean, that's sort of where I begin and end. There's just a lot at stake. There are a lot of children who, their lives are going to be fundamentally different depending on how well our schools are functioning for them. So the
Yeah.
big responsibility, you need people who are able to step up to that. So I think if we're,
And-
any elected members, we ought to be confident.
Yep. And I would say just one more thing, that if without having, and again, we took it out of our bill, and the reason why, because again, it wasn't going to go anywhere without it. But when you don't have compensation, sometimes then it leads to a certain demographic that can participate in it. Those who are more influent and who have that time, the recreational time to give toward this, versus a parent from Little Village, or who's working a job or two, that type of thing. So yeah, so I agree with that.
Thank you. I think this question might be for you, Daniel. It's not clear, but it references you. They're asking, who are the 90% of voters and who do they actually represent? I don't know if that is a reference to some of the focus groups that you did. It says, as Mr. Anello shared, the majority of voters are reported to be a majority of white voters, which does not represent the overwhelmingly Black and Latinx students and families.
I don't know exactly what this question's getting to, but the voters, there's two different voters here. There are the workshops that we ran, which are predominantly Black and brown moms and dads from all across the city, but is a very approximate representation of whose kids are in the school district. So that's one group. So I don't think that's who this person means, but the other group, I'm guessing.
Actually, the person who asked the question just clarified that it was in reference to a comment that was made earlier about a referendum.
Oh, about so the referendum asked a very basic question. Do you want the current board, or do you want a fully elected board? Those are the two options you were given. And if we went into our workshops and we asked that question, we'd probably get the same result. But that is from an equity and inclusion standpoint, that is a very surface level question versus actually starting to ask questions like, should school board members get paid? What do you want the school board representation to look like? Should parents be on the board? How many should be parents? How geographically represented should it be? And when you have a much deeper, robust conversation, which is really what this work should look like, if we're talking about radical inclusion and having everyone at the table, then you get a much more robust answer. So I'm not shocked by that response, because frankly, I think most people would say, yeah, we want to shift away from what we have today because we're unhappy with some of the decisions that have been made, and this would give us what we want in terms of accountability. But it's far more nuanced than that when you actually start asking deep questions.
And I think one of the things that's interesting in the comments you made about your parent conversations, Daniel, is that, after discussion, folks are saying, look, we sort of want what we like about elected. There are some good things about appointed. If you get an election, you kind of don't know what's going to come up through an election. You don't know for sure who's going to run. You don't know for sure who's going to win. You end up with that this balance of, if there are also appointed positions, those appointments can round that out, because there is this, patchwork quilt of expertise that you need in a district as large and sophisticated. So it's an interesting additional.
Yeah, I think
find that balance.
I think that's an important piece that I don't know if I hit properly or spoke to, but that the mayor isn't just given a free pass from the conversations we've had from the parents. It's you use those appointments, to your point, to round out and make sure we have a school board that looks like us, and represents us in the way that we needed to. That was really the crux of the balance. So thank you, Robin.
And I do want to say, I think if you have an appointed board, I don't know what I get from those people, because I don't have a choice in who they are. And if I got to run an election, I have to convince those in my district to vote for me that I can handle this. I think we're thinking of this as if people no, it's an election. You have to run an election. You have to have forums. You got to be able to talk about the issues. You have to be able to make sure that you can handle it. Because I think, yeah, the school district is a huge school district, but I don't want, I think sometimes when we're talking about policy and governance, we make it seem like it's impossible to do. And that's not the case. All the things that runs the school board, they're not going to be doing. Most of the staff, you got staff. hundreds of staff in CPS. You have trainings for board members. You have expertise, legal expertise for the council, those type of things. So you have all that support. It's not like I'm going on the board and I'm just coming out of nowhere and I don't know anything. But I just want to make sure, because it seems like, because I've had this conversation before, we were talking about police accountability and we're talking about elected, that type of thing. And I guess I want us to move away from just saying that I need this type of person on my board and I can't make that decision because I'm incapable of it. And that's kind of what I'm kind of hearing. But I do think that whatever decision is, what they have to have access to all the information so they can make the most, the key is to make the most informed decision. And I think you have it'll be a roundabout group of people who running for you. It will round itself out. But again, if it's appointed, I still don't know what I get. I know what the mayor would want. Yeah. I get whatever the mayor wants. And again, that might not be what I may need. So I just want to make
and just to follow up, to be clear, I'm not coming from it's not that you don't know what you want, that if you have multiple different districts, the school board has to function as a whole, and it both to represent the city as well as to be able to have the balance of expertise and the range of expertise that you need to balance it, to run a district that's as complicated. And we can agree, this is not a just walk off the street. This is a really sophisticated, one of the biggest employers in like the region, not just the city. And so my point isn't that people don't know what they want and they can't vote intelligently. It's that when you divide up the city this way, you don't know what's going to come out of that. There's just no way to know. And that if you have a balance, there's a way to say, okay, here's what we've got, here's who got elected. And then there's an ability to round out. I'm totally with you. You're right. Like the whole point is somebody minding that, is thinking about that as a whole. And I am driven by the fact that there is this research that suggests like if you balkanize, you end up with a different kind of decision-making process. So that's all I'm trying to get at. Is there a way to balance those two things?
Right. But I guess you keep saying a balance, but why do Black and brown people have to have what you consider a balance, in our school district? And again, I go back to my earlier point. This is not brought up in white communities. It's only brought up in communities of color. There's only one across the whole country where you have a education system under male control that's not Black or brown throughout, and that's in New Jersey. I forgot the town. But this is always a conversation, and that's what I brought up the whole equity. Because I do want to be clear about that. That's all, because you're saying balance. Everybody likes balance, using that word, but it's not. You know what I'm saying? It's not. It's like it's taking power away from me and giving it to someone else. But go ahead.
Hey, Rod, I'm saying exactly. Well, what I was saying exactly the opposite of that. So with electoral politics, there's nothing that says that millionaires or people backed by millionaires win every single district in the election. And parents recognize that. And those millionaires may not even have kids in schools. They could be all non-parents. And so in order to get the balance is really to make sure that there's actual equitable representation of parents that are in schools. And so if millionaires get elected, then the appointed positions are mandated to be parents like me that ultimately just want to have a role on the school board, but didn't have a chance in an election. And so it's the exact opposite of that from our standpoint, like that's what parents are talking about. They want a mechanism by which to account for, we cannot control elections. And people who win elections typically have a lot of money or access to really powerful networks.
Well, I hear that, but you're moving off an assumption. You're moving off the assumption that those who are appointed are going to be appointed and exert a free will. Most appointed folks always line themselves with that who appointed them. And so that's
how you structure the appointed process.
Somebody who's going to be on there, okay, yeah, I'm a parent, I'm glad I'm on here now, I can think independently. No, all the appointed boards really fall in line with the person that appointed them. So that's not a balance. That's opposite of that. But I agree with you about elections and money. I mean,
Rod and Daniel, I want to jump in here just to make sure we're being mindful of our time. This has really been a robust conversation. You have all been engaged, as well as our attendees have been very engaged, both here on Zoom as well as on Facebook. So I want to thank each of you for that, but I also want to be mindful of people's time. And if you guys want to stay on, I'm happy to stay on with you. and for anybody else who would like to, but I want to start to wrap us up for people who might have to go. I want to mention one thing before I turn us over to my colleague, Marty Castro. For people who are interested in these kind of conversations about our public schools, I want to make everyone aware of an event that the Chicago Urban League will be co-hosting with Urban League affiliates across Illinois. There will be a virtual discussion coming up on Tuesday, May 18th. That's actually about the proposed $350 million to fund the evidence-based formula for our public schools. So please check out our Facebook page or Twitter or the Chicago Urban League website to learn more about that event and to register for it. And we will actually be welcoming Jessica Ramos and Melissa Figueroa from Advance, Illinois to present on that topic during that discussion. So normally I would like to give everyone like another 1 minute to kind of sum up something else you'd like to say, but I'm actually going to leave that up to Marty, and he can if he would like to. So I just want to, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Marty.
Thank you, Calmetta. I would like to give each panelist just literally a minute to close this out, because it's been such a robust discussion and conversation and a lot of great questions from the audience. I'm sure folks who are on will take an extra 3 minutes to just hear your closing capstone. So if we can start with Rod and then Daniel and then Robin, that would be great.
Thank you. I just, I think this is very important issue. I think, again, the three main pillars are democracy, representation, and equity. I think equity starts with governance. I think any appointed position is only going to be reflective of the person that appoints them. We can, we can say it's going to be independent, but that has not been the case in any of the appointed boards that we've seen in Chicago, let alone other places. Again, it's not a panacea. We're going to have bad folks on the board sometime. I mean, LA, they, again, I'm anti-privatization. They got a whole privatization board that put all this money in and won. But in 4 years, they get to elect a new board. Yeah, just like in our election, 2016, we got someone some people may not like, and 2020 was able to elect someone new. When someone is appointed, you are stuck with that person. And I think that's not what we don't need anymore. We need to be trusted like every other citizen in every other place in Illinois to be able to handle the education decisions for their children. Because we are a city of Black and brown, majority of Black and brown families, we should not have to be insulted with saying, I need someone else to help make decisions for me.
Thank you, Rod. Daniel?
So Rod, you and I have to find some time to hang out, because I agree. I think the biggest piece that I can leave with is, we show up and our job is to just provide a framework and a platform and elevate voices of Black and brown families, mostly in Chicago. And so coming in without a position and really trying to represent their position optimally, ideally, I wouldn't be here. It would be parents who were in those conversations, sharing exactly what I'm trying to share and represent on their behalf. But what they've said they wanted isn't necessarily what's being discussed right now in the two bills. I think there's a lot of missing components. I think the biggest things are that they want parents on the board. They want a diverse board that looks more like the kids in the school district than necessarily what the city of Chicago might look like. They want balance so that accountability is distributed in a balanced way, and that's between the electoral seats and the appointed seats. And they want it to be accessible. They want an opportunity for parents like them to run for these seats and actually sit on the board and make decisions about their own communities and their own schools.
Yeah, and I'll just echo, I really appreciated this conversation, and I keep coming back to, I think there are a whole bunch of things that we should be trying to balance, and one of them clearly is the need for more parent voice and representation. 100% agree with that for all the reasons that Rod has laid out so beautifully and that Daniel has echoed. I think at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that 21 members, it's just a lot of folks. I have real concerns about that. If nothing else, we've had 5 members and 7 members, and we've had results that, again, I are outclassing the country as a whole and have been consistently and steadily. And so I just think we want to be very careful about trying to figure out what was it about the current system that has worked, so we can hold on to the pieces that have worked, even as we are bringing in an elective process and having elected members. So that is, I think, what we've got to be very careful about. There's just a lot at stake.
Palmetto, if this is,
Yeah, I was gonna say, it actually looks like we've lost Marty. Oh, he's back now.
I am back. Sorry about that. I keep having Zoom problems today, but I believe, Robin, you've finished your remarks, your closing remarks. So I just want to say on behalf of Casa Central that we thank the Chicago Urban League for asking us to be a partner today. And on behalf of both the Urban League and Casa Central, I want to thank each of the panelists and of course our moderator for what has been a very robust conversation. I learned a lot, and I know that our participants as well, our attendees, have learned a lot, and I want to thank them for the very unique, very pointed, very important questions. And what is obvious is that while we may have different perspectives on this, we are all united by the fact that we want what's best for the kids of the Chicago public school system. And we really hope that however this decision is made, that it ultimately does inure to the benefit of all the children. Whatever the decision is, I can bet pretty well that we will be back together again, talking about what that next version of how we select our school board is, so that the parents and the communities out there will have even further information on how to make the best choices they can, whether it's elected, whether it's appointed, or whether it is a hybrid system. So thank you all for your participation today, and good night.
Let me also add, because I'm seeing the question on Facebook, the recording will be available on Facebook following this event. But because we did go live a little bit after we started, I will also be sharing that recording with anyone who registered for this event. So you'll have the full recording and be able to see it and share it, because we want other parents to have this information as well. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Good night.
All right.